Welcome to another episode of the From the Periphery podcast, bringing you voices and analysis from the global majority. On May the 12th, following an extensive Congress, the PKK, that is, the Kurdish Workers Party, released a statement announcing their intention to dissolve and end their armed struggle against the Turkish State. This momentous statement comes almost 3 months after the similar call was announced by Abdullah Ocalan, the party's ideological leader who remains in captivity in Istanbul. To get more context about this and understand what exactly this declaration entails, two of our FTP hosts, Aydin and Karena, sat with returning guest Dilan, a Kurdish academic and organizer who has spent the last decade engaging with the Kurdish struggle. Their conversation is a deep dive that goes far beyond the headlines and lackluster coverage of the mainstream media. Before we begin the episode, From the Periphery is a community-supported collective that relies on your support. If you like the work we do and want to see more of it, please check out our Patreon and consider becoming a member. The link will be in the show notes below. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of the From the Periphery podcast. My name is Aydin Yildiz, and I'm here with my co-host, Karena.
Hello.
For our guest today, we have Dilan on to talk about the announcement of the disarmament and disbanding of the PKK. So, Karena, if you want to get us started with the conversation here, we can just dive in.
So on May 12th, after more than 4 decades of conflict, the Kurdistan Workers Party, or PKK, announced that, as Aydin said, would disband and end its armed struggle against Turkey. The PKK was established in the 1970s, and the armed conflict against the Turkish state began in the 1980s. And the PKK has been considered Turkey's top security threat and is labeled a terrorist organization by Ankara. Dilan, I wanted to get started with just sort of, the main concerns, questions that I'm hearing people repeat. These are people who are aligned with PKK just in terms of its ideology, the anti-imperialists. They have family or some sort of, direct or indirect experience of oppression from the Turkish state. People who are close to the structures as well, kind of talking about how this decision was made, because it seems to have come out of the blue for a lot of people. And just to remind listeners, Abdullah Ocalan made this announcement that the organization should disband. And then that was followed up with Dilan, you can clarify, it was a party congress, which involves, it's like a core, like a central committee, right, of kind of the decision makers.
Representatives are sent. They're not all going to convene in one place. They didn't actually even convene in one place. They convened in 2 separate locations. This is not the first Congress. This is the 12th Congress of the PKK over the course of 52 years. And the Congresses, they release statements mostly, but they're not public at all. The dates of them are not known by anyone until after they finish. Anyone who isn't directly involved are going to be there. I think a lot of the internal workings of the party and their decision-making structures and methods are not super clear to people, and there's probably security reasons for that as well. But there is a Congress, and they can last a couple of days, at times have lasted up to a week, where delegates, usually around 200 to 300, sometimes more, meet and discuss. And there's a very sort of democratic, very grassroots democratic process of discussion and decision making. I don't know what their consensus quota is. I hope it's better than the ones I've had to deal with in my own organizing. But yeah, I think we talked about this in the past episode, where the call was made for a transition, basically, for a peace and democratic society in February by Öcalan, in a video that was released from Imrala. The call was to enter the stage of disarming and enter a phase of non-armed struggle, basically, and to disband the PKK as it exists currently, as the party and the name sort of exists currently. Worth noting, and I think I mentioned this in the last podcast as well, this isn't the first time that the PKK has like dissolved and reformed. It happened in 2002. They dissolved and formed under the name KADEK, the Kurdistan Freedom and Democracy Congress, which was like a parliament of party cadre and civilians. And this structuring at that time was also supposed to reflect the movement's transition from armed struggle towards a democratic and political project. This structure had a lot of internal issues, a lot of them having to do with patriarchy and the shift towards the women's movement. And in 2004, there was the ceasefire basically ended and the guerrillas returned to active defense. So this is something that could also happen this time around. Absolutely. I think a lot of the clickbaity headlines that have been coming out, especially from very mainstream media, have been about, oh, the PKK is laying down arms, as if it is like a done deal. When a lot of the statements, both like the actual statement released by the 12th Congress and a lot of statements of people who were there and who have released statements in the last week, are that, no, there are conditions laid out for us to lay down arms. This is the goal that we have, is to be able to do this because the democratic process begins. Yeah, so unilateral ceasefire, sure, holds. However, defense is different, I would say, not just in how we understand defense versus attack, but also like self-defense is very different than like guerrilla war. In 2004, as well, after the resuming of guerrilla warfare, there was another Congress that happened, the Fifth Women's Congress, which formed like the current PEAJK, the ideological cadre party for the women's movement, which is an autonomous counterpart to the PKK. And as far as I know, they will continue to exist, right? They are a separate party organization from the PKK. So the name of the PKK dissolving seems to me very much like a very strategic political move of like, this is a political party and movement that has been declared terrorist for a very, very long time. And the chances of that terrorist designation and the ramifications of it ending are very slim and are very likely not going to happen, especially given the power that the political and mobilizing power that Turkey has within Europe and like the UN, and as far as like the US goes of designation of who is a terrorist. And of course, the power that the monopoly that the state has on designating what is a terrorist and what is legitimate or illegitimate violence. There was some Turkish Marxist who had some interesting comments about there being some kind of dead end or gridlock between the Turkish state and the PKK when it comes to like armed struggle. Like neither of them is really defeating each other in warfare, and it's like not going to happen. And so continuing this means of struggle isn't really bringing about the goals that they are working towards. So they're transitioning to a different era of attempting to advocate for democratic rights for Kurds and others within Turkey and elsewhere. And the importance of like legitimate struggle needing to be continued by revolutionary forces, even if the PKK lays down arms, remains, right? Like there will still be legitimate struggle, whatever that means. And that this is a reconciliation initiative, not a peace process, because peace is something that happens after the war ends, and the war has not ended. And so one of the things that I've seen in a lot of the statements that have come out from representatives who were at the Congress and others is that there are conditions laid for this happening. It's not happening yet, right? This is the goal, but it is not. We're not there yet.
I think that nuance is super important to add, actually, because that is true. All the mainstream kind of news about the announcement is essentially reducing it down to the armed struggle being over. And I think before the Congress, before we had kind of more information coming out from the internal structures, what I was hearing from a lot of people was that it was striking in that nothing had apparently been gained in return. Right, like not even Öcalan's release, like that had been repeated as something as a kind of like a minimum requirement for arms to be laid, is like at least for Öcalan to be released from prison. And in fact, we see that this announcement hasn't also halted Turkish ground operations against PKK positions. And I think it was yesterday, an anonymous Turkish defense official had told a few media organizations that the decision changed nothing, and military operations against the positions were continuing. So I think that's a really, thank you for kind of pulling out that nuance.
Yeah. On the media, real quick, one thing that comes to mind is that there was very specific wording in the statement of the Congress about the conditions of the formation of the PKK and like the struggle and the necessity of the struggle. And a lot of that was like missing from mainstream media coverage of it, and about like, oh, they've been waging war against the Turkish state, and like some of it will even say like, oh, just for the establishment of an independent or separatist Kurdish state. And then a lot of it is like, oh, and there've been like 40,000 deaths, and they don't talk about or mention that like most of those deaths have been civilian deaths, not even like PKK or Turkish military, but like legitimate civilian deaths at the hands of the Turkish state. So the wording of the media is something to also keep in mind here. Of the mainstream media is something to keep in mind here, and also like what's like the goal of the way that they're reporting, right? And the killing of hope for revolutionary movements is something that states generally want, and like the maintaining of power and control kind of depends on or is benefits from. And so the idea that the PKK is like just disbanding and laying down arms and not having gained anything, which isn't true, but the narrative that they are doing this serves a larger goal of saying like, look, armed resistance doesn't work and isn't going to work. And look, even the PKK that's been doing this for 40 years is like laying down arms, when the reality of the situation is very, very different.
Mm.
I think like a day or two after the statement was released, Murat Karali, oof, I always struggle with this name. We're going to say that again. The day after the statement was released, Murat Karayılan, a senior member of the PKK, said that to fully disarm, we must also trust the state, which they very much don't. And he really emphasized that legal steps and changes must be taken by the Turkish state. And I'm not saying, some people have said, well, now everything, like the ball is fully in the court of the Turkish state for them to like implement changes. And that's not entirely true. I think it is mostly true. But he goes on to say that if there's talk of internal peace, then hostility must come to an end, but attacks continue despite our ceasefire. He describes current laws as hostile and in denial of the existence of the Kurdish people, and calls for legal reforms. Only if the state enacts legal and constitutional changes can this movement carry out disarmament. And then emphasize that he's not the only one. A couple of other delegates emphasized the need for Öcalan's physical freedom. To fully disarm, we must also trust the state. The groundwork for transition has been laid through Öcalan, the party's delegation, and the broader movement. And this is why our Congress is able to take certain decisions despite both positive and negative signals from the state. Öcalan must be released to lead this transition, is one of the big things that is being demanded. And that will be, I think, the first step of like goodwill from the Turkish state if they do it, if that happens. I think strategically this announcement and the conditions of it, which haven't always been included in the like mainstream media coverage of it, but in some of them it has been there. I think even Al Jazeera included it. Wild. But if those conditions aren't met, then there is some sense of like accountability if armed struggle resumes. It's like, hey, like we were willing to disarm and we laid out these conditions and they weren't met. So it will hopefully show people, hey, Turkey's the bad guy here. Like there was an offer and it was like not met.
That's actually, I heard that version today from someone saying, basically it was like this strategic move to kind of put out on the table that, yes, we'll dissolve, we'll disarm, but like no one knows what's going to happen because that topic hasn't even been broached yet. But, isn't this kind of putting the ball in Turkey's court, just in the sense that now it's kind of up to Turkey how it will respond? Because the announcement has picked up so much international attention that it's kind of put Turkey under the spotlight rather than the movement at this point, at least.
It is. And some of the statements that have come out really identify that the discussions and dialogues that took place at the Congress are really strategic, and that there was a evaluation of this decision to like shift the struggle. And that's why the Congress was convened, was like the Öcalan statement that was released in February was a call to discuss this, essentially. Like he can make the statement, but it is not a unilateral decision coming from him. There needs to be a decision democratically made by the PKK itself. And this is the first Congress in 14 years,
Really?
which means the last one was in 2011. Yeah. So, I mean, some of this also has to do with like, have there been conditions to safely hold a conference, right?
Yeah.
Like the place that they hold the conference is like
Hmm.
Kandil in the Kandil Mountains.
But it's still, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, it is pretty significant because in the early 2000s, you have a period where there's like multiple conferences happening over the course of like, not so many years. And then there like isn't one for a very long time.
Dylan, can I quickly just ask in terms of like a bigger picture of like the actual conflict? But when the PKK started its armed struggle, it kind of precipitated a Turkish response, etc. Has has Turkish military operations, have they intensified over time? Have they been squeezing out? Like, what's the attrition? What's the picture of like the conflict in terms of the power difference? Obviously, the Turkish state is NATO power, and it's like a killing machine. But you have guerrilla fighters in the mountains who know the mountains, and there's a little bit of advantage there, and there's tunnels. So can you give us a picture of what we're looking at over time?
I think there have been more intense periods of fighting and slightly less intense periods of fighting when we look at like direct sort of conflict between like soldiers and soldiers. The most
Hmm.
intense of that was in the 90s, ending in
Hmm.
99 with the capture of Öcalan. And I also will say that air power and drones have really shifted the dynamic as well. One of the strengths of Kurdish guerrilla movements generally, not just in Turkey, but also in Iraq historically, like in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, was the mountains and being able to hide in the mountains and knowing the mountains in ways that soldiers of the state did not, and being able to be safe in those mountains. And drones have absolutely changed that game. The expansion of Turkish military aggression beyond just attacking PKK fighters within Turkey, but also outside of Turkish borders, so like in Syria and Iraq as well, is something that has been absolutely pushed forward by drone strikes and air power.
Hmm.
And the, well, collapse of the Syrian government and lack of enforcement of like airspace as territorial integrity in Syria, and then also the absolute lack of response from Iraq and the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq to Turkish airspace like violations in northern Iraq. But you also have like in 2015 and 2016, you have really intense repression of civilians in Kurdistan of Turkey, namely in Cizre, which is like at the border with Rojava, and in Ahmed, in Diyarbakir, in Sur, where there was like actual like ground sort of war and heavy shelling. In Cizre, an entire town that attempted autonomy, like dual power formations, was like razed to the ground and people were burned alive in buildings. So there have been like spikes in intense military aggression. There's still a like heavy military presence across Kurdish areas of Turkey, like a massive base within Ahmed, still like in the center of town.
Hmm.
Heavy Turkish military presence in the mountains all over. And like you can see them. I was outside Dersim in my friend's village, and you could just like see the military towers. They're like there looking for guerrillas, different kinds of guerrillas, not just PKK guerrillas. And they have like air vision. Well, I don't know what that wording is. They have yeah, so the police surveillance is like very omnipresent. Police and I mean the line between like police and military when it comes to surveillance is
Hmm.
like kind of thin, but like driving up the mountains outside Dersim to go on a hike had to like report who was going because there were military checkpoints, and they had like aerial view of cars going up those mountains. And the risk of like not doing that is you might get bombed. So that is like a omnipresent oppressive force in like daily life, even in villages, let alone in like cities where there's like heavy state police presence. But yeah, how far did I deviate from the question?
I don't know. I was listening. It was interesting. Doesn't matter.
Worth mentioning that in the 1980s, the first armed struggle of the PKK was not against the Turkish state, but was against Kurdish land-owning tribal agas. There was a very Marxist socialist understanding of how this like tribal feudal mentality was holding society back from achieving socialist liberation, and then shifted to also fighting the Turkish state. Also worth mentioning that the struggle has not only or ever just been armed. Like a big part of the struggle and a big part of you have a huge time gap between the founding of the party and the beginning of armed struggle is the like laying of groundwork for democratic struggle and like community-based, society-based struggle of democratic organizing, community organizing. And I think one of the things that is missing from a lot of discourse around the statement is that there are kinds of struggle that happen in parallel to and will continue on beyond armed struggle. And there are types of struggle, mainly these like democratic types of struggle that have happened, that have predated the armed struggle and will continue to outlive it. And that fighting for democratic freedom and a democratic nation within Turkey and beyond it is not just armed struggle that fights for that, but also the strength of community organizing. And so when the clickbaity headlines are like, oh, the PKK is disbanding and laying down arms, people read that as, oh, the movement is ending. And the movement is not ending at all. This is not like a sign of weakness of the party. It can be read that way, and laying down arms it evokes a lot of emotional responses in people. And one of the delegates even made a comment about how this decision was made removed from emotion. It was very much like, let's rationally assess where we're at and strategically move forward. But that the history of this party and the like identity of the party beyond just armed struggle, it's not just going to vanish when it transforms. And it hasn't vanished in the past when it has transformed, and it has often come back even stronger.
Do you get the sense that people like understand that? I mean, maybe not from like an outside perspective.
From an outside perspective, definitely not.
Right.
I've seen a lot of mixed reactions to this from Kurds themselves. Some who do understand the like workings of the party a bit more, and some who don't as much. And there's like some disdain for the like the Apoist, the Apoju who like just like follow anything he says very blindly. And like that being a way of sort of distancing yourself from like this kind of movement of like, oh, well, I don't just like follow a leader like this, and like this is ridiculous, and this is death, and this is certain death, whatever. I also don't think those people actually read the full statement where it talks about the conditions for disarming. I do think it's fair to have that kind of emotional response because the idea of disarming itself is one that, in the context of the Turkish state, just like blindly disarming absolutely would mean certain death. Like there's no doubt in my mind about that. And there were statements released when Öcalan's statement came out, reminding people of what happened when Kurds disarmed in the 30s and were met with massacres that could also be called genocide and Dersim. So I think there's a lot of confusion. I also think that the attempts to publish statements that try to clarify that, or like publishing interviews with delegates that are saying, hey, like we're not disarming yet, like there's conditions to this, are just being outshadowed by the hullabaloo around the main statement and the like they're disarming, they're disbanding sort of panic. And I do understand that panic. I've like seen echoes of that same sentiment in my own family who are not necessarily like even, PKK types at all, but are just like, wait, why would they do this? Like what is this? What is going on? I think a lot of like confusion and panic initially, and then I've seen a lot of disappointment also of like, oh, well, they're giving up. And that's also not what they're doing. Not understanding the strategy behind it, or maybe also not believing in the ideology that pushes forward this kind of strategic move, could have people very disillusioned with this decision as well.
I was reading somewhere about Turkey's official response to this announcement was something broadly paraphrasing, we welcome the statement and we expect that this disarmament will extend to all of the branches of the PKK, including in Syria. And I know there has been a lot of, the panic that you refer to, and this kind of, what do you mean? What do you mean you're disarming? Has extended to people worried about what will happen in Northeast Syria in the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria, aka Rojava. And I'm just wondering about the links, the connections, not just ideologically, but just, in terms of the networks, what are the differentiations? PYD, which is the party in Northeast Syria, is not the same as PKK. I mean, ideologically, they come from the same place, but could you explain the kind of connections and the differences between those?
Ideologically, there's a shared tie in that they draw their ideological formation from the writings of Öcalan. I think the PYD very much is embodying Öcalan's call for democratic confederalism as a way of organizing society, and the PKK operating within Turkey is very much pushing forward this idea of a democratic nation within Turkey. So slightly different ideological trajectories, though still both influenced by his thought. The parties are distinct. They have distinct decision-making processes. The PYD was not involved in the Congress of the PKK. They released a statement afterwards saying along with a bunch of other Kurdish parties, including in Bashur, released statements in support of this and being like, we see this call and, that's great. But also very, very firmly state this does not apply to us because we are not the PKK. And this distinction is going to be difficult to navigate when Turkey calls them a part of the PKK and has used that narrative to justify continued attacks on Rojava and incursions into Rojava, like imperialist incursions, like land grabs, burning of farmland, airstrikes, targeted killings, which they continue to do, and chemical attacks in Rojava and also in northern Iraq. There is one way of understanding these different parties as, how was it described in that book? That they're all planets that revolve around the sun. That is the ideology, that is Öcalan. But that is a 15-year-old analysis, and I don't know that really applies anymore. And I think the PYD operates very independently from the main PKK structure, and also are very much influenced by and very much in support of Öcalan's writings, as it has provided the foundation for how they've organized society, but also have their own democratic processes for making decisions that are in a different context than the PKK operating within Turkey. Some people do understand the PKK as an umbrella organization and a bunch of different parties fall underneath it. And I think that's a very 2D understanding of it. And it would be more prudent, I think, to look at a bunch of different parties as in relation to each other. And they have links to each other for sure, historical and ideological, but are separate entities with separate decision-making processes. This includes the women's organizations of the PKK, and also includes, to some extent, the Dem Party, which is born out of the same idea of democratic nation, but is absolutely not at all part of the PKK, but a part of Turkish parliamentary politics instead as a party. So linked to it, that is a narrative of the Turkish state that I won't repeat. They say that everyone in the Dem Party at times, and also at times every Kurd in Turkey declaring that they are a Kurd is a terrorist. But that again goes back to how the state is the arbiter of, is the sole legitimate arbiter of violence against civilians, violence at all. And any kind of Fanonian cathartic violence or self-defense is seen as terrorism.
Which connects, just briefly, back to the mainstream narratives about the announcement. In fact, just in quick preparation before this episode, I just Googled PKK to look at the structure, and the first entry that comes up is the Turkish government's entry on the PKK, and the first sentence is the PKK is a terrorist organization.
And the narrative of a terrorist organization is laying down arms is plays into this framing that wants people to stop believing that we can fight for a different world. And that we can fight against the violence of the state to advocate for ourselves.
That it's a futile endeavor at all. Yeah,
I was curious about the, you're talking a little bit ago about how the media narrative is pretty solidified, that, there's this Turkish official that was saying nothing about their plan has changed. And, seeing that and hearing about that, I'm kind of there's a big part of me that's okay, it's not surprising that the media is having this really kind of, or mainstream media is having this really sort of basic flattening narrative that feeds into the Turkish state's desires to completely control like how we talk about this and say, well, okay, look, now they're putting down arms and they just we expect them to comply with us. And I'm curious about like what leverage there is now to say like is there leverage to say like we have decided or like we're engaging in this process and we have conditions for like whether or not we actually end up following through on this laying down of arms, and as the Turkish state comes back and carries on with their plan to just like persecute any Kurd for being Kurdish, basically, like is there, I don't know, do you feel like there's a place for like now that we're being met with, or now that we've like engaged in this process and if we're being met with violence, like is there a place for more leverage to like come back into or control the narrative a little bit more of like, see like the Turkish state is not actually complying with us? Like do you see a place for that? Is there like, I mean, you mentioned Al Jazeera is maybe not the best place to get information. Like, is there a place that we can like look to like hear the other side of the story?
Interestingly, a lot of the mainstream media did cite the source of like where they read the Congress statement, even if they didn't actually pull meaningful quotes from it, which is the Fırat News Agency, INF. And they name it as like, Fırat News Agency linked to the party. And they've published a lot of interesting interviews with other delegates who were there, Cemil Bayek, Murat Karayalan, and others. Statements released like post Congress. There's a couple of others. Hawar News, Anha News Agency. There's a lot of them are like somewhat party affiliated or like seen as having a very uncritical narrative, or uncritical sort of reporting on it. Uncritical in the sense of like they just repeat PKK sort of like statements. But if you're looking for statements from the PKK, that's where you go. Furthermore, there isn't really news reporting that doesn't have some kind of bias. It's more about being aware of what the bias is and not necessarily seeing bias as an inherently bad thing, but more of an orientation. So like the orientation of these news agencies is pro this kind of Kurdish struggle and anti this kind of state oppression by Turkey and others. And as far as leverage goes, I mean, I think having Fırat News Agency in like the mouths of all of these mainstream media outlets is something that I don't know has happened as much before, and that like possibly a line of communication is now open. So if conditions aren't met and armed struggle resumes or something shifts, then there can be statements released that may actually be picked up by media of like, well, if everyone has now published, oh, PKK is disbanding, and then like a year from now, armed struggle resumes, they're going to be like, hey, like what happened? I thought they said they were going to do this. And then we'll hopefully reach out for comment, not just to Turkish state officials, but also to like Fırat News Agency or others. So in that sense, like, I don't know about leverage when it comes to accountability, like holding the Turkish state accountable. Maybe there are means of leverage that I just don't know about and probably shouldn't, mainly in the form of like resumed armed struggle. But as far as like news accountability or like public statement accountability, there might be a bit more now than there was before, which is an interesting development at the least. But yeah, we'll see. The Turkish state's response has not been particularly heartwarming. There were some statements about like MIT and the Turkish state overseeing the disarmament.
MIT, by the way, that's for the listeners, it's the Turkish intelligence services.
That, yeah, Turkish intelligence and the Turkish state would be overseeing the disarmament and disbanding of the PKK. And also shaking my head to that. Their definition of what the PKK is includes the like Saturday mothers who protest the imprisonment of their children and civilians in different parts of Kurdistan, so not to be trusted at all. And I also don't think that will be allowed. I mean, I think the disarmament and disbanding of the PKK will absolutely happen internally and as part of a like longer, protracted democratic process.
Yeah, if it's not obvious to listeners, the Turkish state narrative is extremely patronizing and extremely biased toward like their own goals and just like never to be trusted. The message I'm getting here is like people should really read the statements and not just like look at the mainstream media narratives or even like the summaries don't do the intention and the like the thoughts behind all this justice at all. And if you're really trying to understand more of the context and more of like where is this headed, like and kind of come away from a really reactionary view of this development, like we really need to be, I mean, and I think this is the case with like no matter what we're looking at, but like it's you just have to dig a little deeper and not trust the first thing that comes across your timeline. And I so deeply admire like how much thought and intention goes into communicating this with the world, and it's really frustrating and like I don't know, sad to me how easily people just kind of miss that and don't actually like take the extra 10 minutes to like dig a little deeper. And yeah, I mean that's part of why I was curious how like or asking you earlier, like how are Kurds reading this? Like how are people who might have more context and more desire to like learn a little bit more deeply, like what's going behind these or what's behind these decisions, like how is this going to progress for what does this mean for us? So it's interesting to hear you say that like a lot of folks are seeing this like kind of broad level headlines and also having the same kind of reactions like, oh no, are we like giving up our fight here? And clearly like that's not what anybody is saying who's actually like making these decisions, right? It's just and I really appreciate also the perspective of like this has happened before, like there's historical context for like it's not just gonna like be over now.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that even a lot of Kurds, and I'm based in Bashur, so like the reactions I've been seeing there really reflect to me the inability of a lot of people, not just of my generation, but also like my parents' generation, to conceptualize a struggle in different ways. And Southern Kurdistan is a whole other political nightmare for many reasons that we don't have to get into. But the like general de-radicalization, I think, of entire populations, thanks to liberalism and capitalist modernity, among many other things, makes it difficult to not only imagine a different world, but also imagine a different way of achieving that different world, and to like dream beyond the ways that we have like struggled in the past, and to dream beyond the ways of struggle that are allowed, even in a very limited sense of the word, by like the state. And this statement and this strategic shift, and I think also past strategic shifts and ways of organizing of the PKK are very foreign to people for many reasons, but one of them is that it involves a very high level of civic engagement that even, Americans who were like, oh, we live in a democracy, even if that hasn't been true for a very long time. And even if we want to question if a representative democracy is even a democracy, cannot conceptualize of like high levels of civic engagement at all, because even like voting in a representative democracy it does not have high levels of engagement, let alone attending like weekly meetings or like organizing your neighborhood and like discussing theory and ideology with neighbors, friends, family. It's a very different context, and it's a very different ball game, and a very different approach is had, if there is one at all. And so trying to like wrap your head around all of this, or even engaging with it, is kind of unimaginable for a lot of people, because they're like, okay, well, armed struggle is what has worked, or only democratic organizing is what will work, or only reform is what will work. And this third path is like third way of doing things, third, fourth, fifth way, or whatever, of doing things, is just very different, because it involves like high levels of democratic organizing societally, has also involved armed struggle, but is multifaceted, very dynamic, very complex, and very comprehensive. And for your like average person, even average Kurd living in Kurdistan, who isn't politicized and isn't involved in any kind of political organizing, or is like avoiding it because of the conditions of political organizing wherever they are, it's a different type of attempting to understand than like, say, like for us as like leftists who grew up outside of the homeland, and have done different kinds of like grassroots organizing that weren't necessarily always like ethnicity based or nationalist or whatever it was, but rather like more anarchist based or more like community oriented based, mutual aid based, and a very different sense of like organizing and different way of understanding the means that we have to self-organize to change our living conditions and our material conditions. And then also linking material conditions under capitalism to lived conditions as a like oppressed ethnic minority is one thing that they've done very, very well, and something that is like harder for people to understand in different contexts, not in that same context.
Yeah, I mean that kind of civic engagement, like there's a reason that's such a threat to authoritarian regimes in the region, because it's an empowered it's a method to empower the people, and I mean that is what we want to see as people who are interested in growing democratic ways of living and fighting back against the oppression of people for just being who they are. That feels like a decent note to end on here today. I mean, we could go on for hours, and as we've mentioned, we had you on for the Fire These Times episode. We'll link to that in the show notes if listeners want to get more context, and we'll probably have follow-up conversations to come about this topic going forward as we see things develop, so that people can get a little bit more perspective in our corner of things and go beyond the mainstream media narratives. Are there any places that you would like people to be able to find you online, follow you, or other things that you'd like to
pitch or plug? If people want one good resource on the evolution of the PKK, if people are looking for some good history of the PKK and the many iterations of it and the ways that it has like formed and reformed, one very accessible book is The Kurdish Women's Movement, History, Theory, and Practice by Dilan, and she has a very extensive analysis of the different ways that the party has formed and reformed, more specifically within the context of like the women's movement itself. But it has been an integral part of the PKK for a very long time, and it is obviously very well like cited and sourced, and is I would say a great introductory text. And there are others I can put together like a list if people also want more things to read. I've done that before, I think.
Awesome. We'll include all of those resources in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us, Dilan. This was really helpful to get a little bit more of a rundown on what's going on, and appreciate having you on as always. And I imagine we'll have you on again to discuss more follow-up and as things develop. And thank you again, Karena, for joining us here as well. We'll link again, as I said earlier, we'll link to any more resources in the show notes, and yeah, we'll see how things go, I guess.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to hopefully doing this again in hopeful, optimistic conditions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dilan. And bye, everybody.
From the Periphery is a worker-owned media collective. We focus on elevating voices, struggles, and ideas that are peripheralized and marginalized under mainstream journalism and academia. If you like the work we do and want to see more of it, please consider heading over to patreon.com and become a member today. For as little as $5 a month, you get access to exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, and to join the community that's been growing around our work. If you can't support financially, there are still a number of ways you can support us. You can leave a 5-star rating on the podcast app you're using to listen, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're listening, all of which helps us against the algorithm. Most importantly, tell your friends and family about us to help spread the word. Thank you so much for listening.